If the most notorious mafia boss in America, Al Capone, is known as the mastermind of the Valentine's Day Massacre, George Moran is remembered as the victim of that massacre. But that victim was not an ordinary person. That person was one of Al Capone's biggest rivals, George Moran. If you were standing in the territory of the Northern Gang, the bars you were sitting in, the bottles of whiskey or beer you were drinking, were all owned and supplied by Moran and his gang. George Moran was born on August 21, 1893, on Paul Street near Minneapolis, Minnesota. George Moran was not originally from Chicago, but he lived in the city during its darkest years, when bootlegging was rampant and gangs were fighting each other in the underworld. During those years, Moran's name appeared in the papers almost every week, with dozens of crimes and charges related to the bootlegging trade. If it weren't for his notoriety and the huge sums of money he made during the Prohibition era, Moran would have met an ignominious death, and his body would have been buried in a pauper's grave. Meanwhile, Moran's parents, father of Irish descent, mother of Finnish descent, were hardworking, honest people who always wanted the best for their son. With such a wish, around 1899, they decided to leave Minneapolis for Chicago when George was only 6 years old. According to family acquaintances, George seemed to resemble his mother more, inheriting her large, brown, intelligent eyes. When the Morans first arrived, they settled in Kilgubbin, an Irish neighborhood north of the Chicago River. In the mid-19th century, Kilgubbin was considered a nice suburb of the city, but over the years it became increasingly run down, and by the time the Morans moved in, Kilgubbin was considered a place for thieves only, as it was nicknamed Hell's Kitchen or Little Hell. Among the salons, brothels, flea markets, and billiard halls that were trying to squeeze in. Among the families trying to find peace there were also dozens of thieves, prostitutes, and homeless people. Morality and common rules of conduct thus disappeared. As expected, all of these factors soon took their toll on Moran, who gradually spent more time hanging around the streets than attending school. He also learned a valuable lesson early on that no matter how hard he worked, his father rarely earned enough to support the family. Desperate to help his father, Moran began earning pennies and dimes by stealing unshielded wagons and holding them until the owners brought a ransom. It was a risky business that quickly earned Moran a reputation as a young Jesse James, and also gave Moran the opportunity to become a member of Kilgubbin's most vicious gang of thugs. There was nothing these thugs wouldn't do. They used every trick to make money, stealing, breaking into houses, shops, breaking into safes. Some even fought with the police. The most ferocious thug was the young Charles Dean O'Banion, and he was also highly regarded within the Riser group. Moran quickly joined O'Banion's group, and by 1917, before he was 24, Moran had a long criminal record. He was first imprisoned in 1910 for robbery, then again in 1913 for robbery and burglary, and again in 1917 for theft, though this conviction was quickly overturned. Of course, Moran was not the only O'Banion devotee who joined his gang. Himmy Weiss and Vincent Drucci were also among them. In 1912, while the gang was robbing a warehouse, Moran was the only one caught. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison and incarcerated in Joliet State Prison on the south side of Chicago. Joliet Prison was hell. The living conditions were filthy, the work was boring, and the guards were brutal. Moran endured, and after his release he quickly returned to his gang, where he was warmly welcomed. O'Banion especially respected and appreciated Moran because he did not betray his accomplices in the case. O'Banion and Himmy then split off to form their own gang, the North, and Moran joined them. The Northern gang was not interested in petty crimes. O'Banion and Himmy wanted to make big money and tried to focus on stealing valuable items such as women's furs. Another way they made money was by acting as protectors for newspaper companies. At the time, the two companies often hired thugs to intimidate the vendors of rival newspapers. O'Banion and his gang roamed the streets, looking for targets to threaten and punish. Sometimes they would set fire to newsstands or simply threaten the vendor until he was scared to death. Despite all this evil, Moran felt justified in choosing to join O'Banion's gang. Moran had a fiery temper, and when he was angry, he was like an erupting volcano, which earned him the nickname Bugs, streetwise for crazy. At first Moran hated the nickname and threatened anyone who dared to call him that, but it was later said that he enjoyed the nickname that brought him fame. Crazy Moran and O'Banion, along with Weiss and Drucci, often hung out at the North Clark Street bar. O'Banion even worked as a bartender there. McGovern's bar was also a great place to meet and relax with his friends, including politicians, public employees, industrial managers, judges, businessmen, and union bosses. It was a relationship that was very important to the North Side gang. As the election season progressed, O'Banion and his gang were paid to disrupt polling stations by any means necessary. By 1923, Mad Moran had become O'Banion's right-hand man, and most people who had dealings with him feared him. Prohibition also made him incredibly rich, which gave O'Banion and other bootleggers a chance to make even more money in a short period of time. Prohibition was an opportunity for thousands, if not hundreds, of gangsters to make money. By this time, Moran, O'Banion and their gang had completely dominated Kilgubin, where politicians and police had been bribed. Their territory was constantly growing and their voices were also more weighty. If you were in North Side territory, the bars you were sitting in, the whiskeys and beers you were drinking, were all owned and supplied by Moran and his gang. However, no one owned all of Chicago. Other gangs ruled other areas besides the North Side. Johnny Torrio and his new associate, Al Capone, owned the South Side of Chicago. Torrio was a shrewd businessman who murdered his uncle because he didn't want to get involved in the bootlegging business. Torrio ruled the South Side and, as John Kobler describes in his book Al Capone, in his heyday, Torrio was probably the most cunning criminal ever written. By 1921, when he realized that the best way for all those operating in the bootlegging trade to make money was to divide up their territories, Torrio held a meeting where the territories were clearly divided, and the gangs unanimously approved the division. However, no matter how hard they tried to maintain stability, the peace was unlikely to last. Some gangs had already invaded the other side's territory. Moran had always assumed that if the goods of the North were being looted, Johnny Torrio would surely be the culprit. Moran and O'Banion shared a deep hatred for Al Capone. Moran blamed Torrio for any problems in the North, calling him names like Fat and Scarface. In retaliation, O'Banion set up a trap for Capone's boss. In May 1924, O'Banion informed Capone that he would no longer be running the brewery and offered Torrio $500,000 to buy his stake in the Seabins Brewery. Torrio agreed without hesitation. On May 19th, O'Banion invited Torrio to the Seabins Brewery to sign the contract. However, Dean O'Banion did not tell Torrio that the police planned to raid the Seabins Brewery that day. When Torrio arrived, he was arrested for his second bootlegging offense and sentenced to 9 months in prison. O'Banion, of course, got off scot-free and only had to pay a small fine. This and many other blatant retaliations set off a series of other horrific events. On November 10, 1924, O'Banion was shot dead by 3 unknown gunmen while he was working at his favorite flower shop. His funeral was one of the largest the underworld had ever seen. Thousands of people lined the streets to witness the funeral, and his wife looked devastated. Among those people, it was impossible not to mention O'Banion's close friends and an important figure, Moran. With O'Banion gone, the trio announced in a major newspaper that they would continue O'Banion's cause. They signed the head of the committee clause. Another close friend, Louis Altieri, also declared war on O'Banion's killer. On the evening of January 22, 1925, when Chicago was covered in several inches of snow, a black sedan slowly stopped in front of the restaurant on State Street, and the person who stepped out of the car was none other than Capone. As Capone approached the door, 3 men, Moran, Himmy Weiss, and Drucci, also stepped out of their cars. Each of them automatically approached Capone's car, smashed the car, and attacked the driver. Because he was not in the car, Capone was not scratched, but this near-death experience made him think twice. After O'Banion's death, a series of revenge events took place between the North and South Chicago gangs. In mid-January, Johnny Torrio returned to Chicago. On January 24th, when he and his wife returned from the market, 2 gunmen were waiting for him, Moran and Himmy. Himmy fired first, wounding Torrio in the chest and jaw. Then Moran appeared and dealt with him. It is said that as he was dying, he seemed to have muttered, "Shoot me dead, Deanie," although that may have been a fabrication. However, what happened next is unclear. Moran removed the magazine and found it empty. They kept shooting without knowing that the gun was empty and then ran away without knowing what happened to the victim. Torrio was taken to the hospital on a stretcher and questioned about identifying his two attackers. Torrio did not say anything. Instead, a witness identified his attackers, and when shown a photo of O'Banion's coffin, the witness pointed to Moran as the first person to shoot Torrio. He continued to affirm his identification when the police brought him face to face with Moran and said, "You are the killer." Moran was released on bail. After recovering in the hospital, Johnny Torrio was taken to the Lake County Jail to serve a 9-month sentence for the Seabens Brewery case. After his release, he treated himself to a European vacation, leaving Al Capone alone in his kingdom. The war was on. Al Capone started it all on June 13, 1925, while sitting in a car at the corner of Sangamon and Congress Streets. A black limousine drove by and attacked them. Seriously injured, they managed to escape from the car and dragged themselves to a nearby hospital for several weeks of treatment. Weiss and Drucci were next on the hit list, having been attacked twice in 1926 and both survived. However, the final shootout took place in the town of Cicero, the suburb where Torrio and Capone were hiding, on September 20, 1926. According to several witnesses, late that afternoon, Al Capone was having dinner at the hotel when a convoy of 6 cars drove up, machine guns pointed at the curtained windows. However, despite the continuous barrage of shots, Capone was not harmed. Normally, he would have been furious at what had just happened because it was considered an insult to his leadership ability. In his mind, the two names behind this incident always appeared, Moran and Weiss. Not only Capone thought so, but some researchers also believed that the incident was definitely caused by Moran's gang. However, after a series of violent attacks on each other, Capone was tired. A truce was inevitable. On October 4th, in the center of Chicago, he sent his representative Tony Lombardo to talk to Himmy Weiss and plan a business deal. Weiss, still angry about the O'Banion murder, demanded that Capone hand over the 2 men Weiss and Moran believed were responsible for Dean's shooting, John Scalise and Albert Anselmi. But when Lombardo conveyed this to Capone, he vowed never to turn them over. War broke out again, and a week after Capone refused Weiss's demands, Weiss was murdered. On October 11, 1926, Weiss had just attended the trial of Joe, whom Weiss was trying to bait for information. He walked into the Northern Gang's offices above Dean O'Banion's former flower shop on State Street, unaware that 2 gunmen were watching him across the street. Suddenly, Weiss's window shattered, glass and bullets flew everywhere, and in a moment Weiss was lying in a pool of blood. The loss of another close friend and business partner was not good news for Moran and the Northern Gang. It was not difficult to continue to confront Capone, but that was just a feeling. The smart lawyer known as another close friend of Moran advised Moran to keep peace with Al Capone. Shortly after the proposal was made, a meeting was held at the Sherman Hotel. All the leaders of the Chicago gangsters were present. Once again, a peace agreement was reached that was beneficial to all groups. However, like the previous peace agreement initiated by Johnny Torrio, this one did not last long. In April 1927, Vincent Drucci was killed by a policeman. George Moran had lost all his close friends by this time, and although he ruled the North, he must have felt very lonely. Capone was still a thorn in the side of Moran's gang, and he was constantly attacking the North. Moran eventually allied with Irishman Terry Druggon, formerly of the West but at odds with Capone. Moran also allied with notorious bootlegger Ted Newberry and other gunmen like Jake Zuda. The flower shop where he lost 2 of his best friends was no longer safe, and he decided to move his office location because everyone knew where he was, and the flower shop was mentioned not only in the newspapers but also nationwide. Moran moved all operations to 127 North Dearborn, the heart of the Loop. At the same time, Moran also gradually promoted activities to manipulate Al Capone's business. Under Moran's management, the North Side Gang was still considered one of the most dangerous enemies to the other gangs as in the time of O'Banion, Weiss, and Drucci. On the Chicago highway, they attacked the truck carrying liquor that had just been delivered by the Purple Gang to Capone and the ship carrying liquor from Canada that had just arrived to deliver the entire cargo of whiskey to Capone. Around the same time, Moran began to change his image, often wearing pinstriped suits and fedoras to work. Not only that, but shortly before taking over the Northern crew, he married a bar singer who went by the stage name Alice Roberts. Of Sioux and Indian descent, Alice completely won Moran over and moved in with Moran in a luxury apartment on Belden Avenue. They later moved into a suite at the Parkway Hotel, just steps from the Carthage station. If Moran's personal life was rosy, his business was equally turbulent. Al Capone was still his sworn enemy. To survive, he had no choice but to befriend the mafia to avoid the revenge of his rivals. On February 14, 1929, heavy snow fell in the Chicago area, causing traffic jams in some areas due to the severe weather. It was a dreadful winter day in Chicago. However, the night before that day, something seemingly unremarkable happened. While Moran was sitting in his office, a phone call came in offering Moran a truckload of whiskey that had just arrived from Detroit for as little as $57 a case. It was an offer he couldn't refuse. Moran offered to transport the cargo to the Carthage Company warehouse so his men could unload it. On February 14th, Valentine's Day, Bugs Moran set out on his own. However, on the way, his car collided with a truck, causing Moran to arrive a little late at the meeting point. Meanwhile, at the warehouse, 7 of Moran's trusted men waited for their boss to arrive. Suddenly, a car that looked like a police car stopped outside. 5 people got out of the car, 3 in uniform and 2 in plain clothes. Believing that this was just a normal police raid, Moran's men did everything they were told. It was just, put your face against the wall and put your hands on your head. There was nothing to worry about. However, within 120 seconds, according to the later investigation agency's estimate, about 150 bullets, Thompson submachine guns and 2 shotguns, were fired into those 7 bodies. 6 people died on the spot, and only 1 person was still breathing when the fake police group left. At that moment, Bugs Moran also drove up. Seeing the police cars parked outside as well as his gang, he assumed this was a familiar raid, so he drove straight away. By the time the real police arrived at the scene, they only had time to hear Frank Gussenberg, the dying man, say, "They are not cops." The entire Chicago criminal world quickly figured out who was behind this gruesome massacre, and so did the police. The city council, the Chamber of Commerce, and the U.S. Attorney's Office offered a reward of up to $100,000 for anyone who could bring in the killer or provide evidence. The problem was, Al Capone was not in Chicago at the time of the murders. He had gone to Miami to create a perfect alibi for himself. And like all the other crimes he had committed, such as smuggling, casino protection, prostitution, extortion, loan sharking, bribery of officials, and even murder, Al Capone could not be brought to justice. Moran knew that Al Capone was responsible for the incident. By mid-1930, Moran decided to leave the group and move away from Chicago. He first went to Wisconsin, then Minnesota. His marriage to Alice had broken down and he was no longer as rich as he had been. Moran decided to go to Illinois to seek opportunities. With a local gang, he began robbing banks and gas stations. Finally, in 1946, Moran was caught by the FBI. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison for bank robbery and sent to prison. After his release, he committed another crime and was sentenced to another 10 years. During his final years in prison, Moran was diagnosed with lung cancer. He died on February 25, 1957. The prison's Catholic chaplain recorded, "George Moran died a peaceful death and was performed according to the Catholic rites while he was still conscious. The rites were performed a few days before his death, and he did not suffer before he died. I believe that God was merciful to him."
Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if you enjoyed the content. And as always, feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments below. See you in the next one.